The smell of rain still lingered in the air as Caleb stopped in front of his neighbor's house. The lights were off, and the silence felt heavier than usual. He knew why. The Parker family was in mourning. Ever since Sarah, the mother of the family, had passed away unexpectedly, their once lively home had sunk into an almost palpable emptiness. He didn't know them well, just the occasional nod or brief exchange when they crossed paths on the street. But now, as he looked at the closed windows and the absence of any movement, a sense of unease crept over him. Is anyone checking on them? He wondered. He couldn't just ignore the pain happening so close to him. And then, something unexpected happened. A small decision, seemingly insignificant to the rest of the world, but one that would change everything. Before I continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And tell me in the comments, have you ever done something kind that turned someone's day around? Caleb walked back into his kitchen and, without overthinking it, started cooking. He wasn't a chef, but he knew food had a way of bringing comfort. The warm aroma of spices filled his small apartment as he prepared a hearty stew. Simple, but made with care. When he was done, he took a deep breath and stepped outside, holding the warm container in his hands. It was just a meal, but what he didn't know was that, on this night, he was about to start something much bigger than he imagined. Caleb hesitated for a moment at the Parker family's doorstep. The steam from the food curled into the chilly night air as his mind scrambled for the right words. What if they think I'm overstepping, he wondered. But then he thought of the dark house, the heavy silence. Grief has a way of isolating people. Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. A long pause followed. For a moment, he considered leaving the food at the door and walking away. But then, hesitant footsteps sounded from inside, and the door cracked open. It was Michael, the father. His exhausted face and red-rimmed eyes spoke of sleepless nights. Behind him, Caleb caught sight of two children, Lily and Ben, curled up under a blanket on the couch. "Hey, sorry to bother you," Caleb started, gripping the container with both hands. "I just thought you guys might like a warm meal." Michael blinked a few times, as if trying to process what was happening. Then, in a low, hoarse voice, he finally spoke. "This is for us?" "Yeah. I just made it. I know it's not much, but I thought maybe it could help." For a second, Caleb thought Michael might turn him down. But instead, the man took a deep breath and opened the door a little wider. "Do you want to come in?" Caleb hadn't expected that. He had only planned to drop off the food and leave. But as he stepped over the threshold, he felt something shift. At the dining table, he set the stew down, and Ben's eyes lit up at the smell. The 6-year-old glanced at his dad, silently asking for permission. "Go ahead, you can eat," Michael said, forcing a tired smile. Lily, the older one, carefully filled a plate for her brother first. Caleb noticed how gentle and deliberate her movements were, as if she had taken on a role far too heavy for someone her age. He sat at the edge of the table, not wanting to intrude. But when Michael pulled out a chair and sat beside him, it was as if an invisible wall had begun to crumble. I really appreciate this, Caleb. I didn't have the energy to cook today." "I can imagine. Losing someone. It throws everything off balance." Michael nodded, looking at his kids. "Yeah. And the hardest part is that life doesn't stop, you know? They still need meals, routine, a sense of normalcy. But He trailed off, eyes flickering away as he swallowed back emotion. Caleb didn't try to fill the silence. He just stayed. In that moment, watching the family eat something he had made, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was just a meal, but it meant so much more. And then, without overthinking, Caleb made his next decision. "If you don't mind, I could bring another meal tomorrow. You don't have to worry about that for now." Michael looked up, surprised. "You'd really do that?" "Of course, one day at a time." Michael took a deep breath, as if that simple gesture had lifted a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Then, I guess I'll take you up on that." Caleb smiled. He didn't know it yet, but that impromptu dinner would only be the beginning. The next morning, Caleb woke up earlier than usual. There was something different inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. As he sipped his coffee, he looked at the kitchen and realized how much that simple act of cooking the night before had stirred something in him. He wasn't the type to make big charitable gestures. He had always thought helping others was something better people did. But now he realized it wasn't about being better or worse. It was about being there. Without overthinking, he started preparing something new to take to the Parkers. This time, he went with a comforting homemade dish, pasta with rustic tomato sauce and well-seasoned meatballs. The rich aroma filled his kitchen, bringing with it an unexpected nostalgia. It was his mother's favorite meal. She always said that a simple dish, made with love, could warm even the coldest heart. When he arrived at the Parker house, holding the warm container, he knocked on the door with less hesitation than the day before. Still, when Michael opened it, he looked surprised to see him again. "You really brought another meal," Michael said, glancing at the package in Caleb's hands. "I said I would." Caleb smiled. "Pasta and meatballs. I think the kids will like it." Michael looked over his shoulder and called for his children. Lily and Ben appeared at the door, more alert than they had been the night before. Ben was the first to react. "Pasta? For real?" "Yep, buddy, and I promise it's good." The boy's eyes lit up with excitement, and he grabbed the container from Caleb's hands before his dad could even say anything. "This smells really good," Lily said, peeking inside. Michael chuckled, for the first time looking a little less weighed down. "You're winning them over through their stomachs." Caleb shrugged, trying to hide just how much that meant to him. "I know food doesn't fix everything, but it helps." Michael was quiet for a moment, then stepped aside and tilted his head. "Want to come in?" This time, Caleb didn't hesitate. As they filled their plates and sat down at the table, he noticed how the atmosphere felt lighter than the night before. There was still sadness in their eyes, but something new had settled in as well, a flicker of hope. Lily, who seemed to be the most reserved of the three, was the one who broke the silence first. "My mom used to make meatballs like this." Caleb swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't have to. Michael placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder and nodded. "That's true. Sarah loved cooking. I think it was part of how she showed love. Maybe that's why I like cooking so much too," Caleb said, without even realizing he had spoken out loud. Michael looked at him, curious. "Your mom used to cook too?" Caleb gave a small, somewhat melancholic smile. "Yeah, and I only realized how much it meant after I lost her." For a moment, no one said anything. But there was something in the air, a quiet connection, something that didn't need words to be understood. Then Ben, being the child he was, shattered the moment with disarming sincerity. "So, does that mean cooking is a way of saying I care?" Caleb laughed, and Michael looked at his son, surprised by the depth of that question. "I think so, Ben. I really think so." And right there, in that small kitchen, around a simple table, something started to change. Caleb couldn't quite explain what it was. He just knew he wanted to come back the next day, and the next, and the next. In the days that followed, Caleb's routine shifted without him even realizing it. Every morning, before heading to work, he was already thinking about what he would cook later. His thoughts no longer revolved solely around his own problems, but around what he could prepare for that family who, somehow, had become a part of his life. The Parkers, too, had started to expect him. Not in a way that felt anxious or dependent, but in a quiet, welcoming way. Michael had begun leaving the door slightly open around the time Caleb usually arrived. The children, once withdrawn, now greeted him with shy but genuine smiles. That particular evening, Caleb decided to make a creamy vegetable soup served with fresh bread. Nothing too fancy, but warm and comforting. When he arrived at the Parker house, he found Michael standing on the porch, staring up at the dark sky, lost in thought. "Good evening," Caleb said, stepping closer. Michael turned to him and gave a faint smile. "Good evening. Ready for another dinner?" "Always." They walked inside together, and soon the aroma of warm food filled the house. Lily helped set the table, and Ben took on the job of bringing the bread over. Slowly, this was becoming a ritual. As they ate, Michael finally said something Caleb hadn't expected. "I just want to say, thank you, Caleb. You didn't have to do this for us." Caleb took a sip of his soup before replying, "Who said I have to? I want to be here." Michael sighed, fidgeting with his napkin. After Sarah passed, everything just collapsed. I thought I had to be strong for the kids. But the truth is, I was just surviving. I can imagine. Losing someone leaves a hole that nothing seems to fill. Exactly. And when you have kids, it's even harder. I didn't want them to feel like everything had changed. But it had changed. And I didn't know how to rebuild any kind of normal for us. Lily, who had been quietly listening, spoke in a soft voice. But now it feels better. Michael looked at her, surprised. Better? The girl shrugged. It still hurts, but before, it was just pain. Now, at least, there's something good in our day. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. And, as always, Ben lightened the mood. It's because Caleb brings really good food. Everyone laughed, but deep down, they all knew it wasn't just about the food. Michael took a deep breath and met Caleb's eyes. I never imagined that something so simple could change so much. But it has. Caleb smiled and shook his head. Honestly, I think it's changing all of us, and he realized it was true. Helping the Parkers wasn't just about them. It was about him too. Without even noticing, that small act was transforming his own life. That week, the Parker house started to feel different. Not physically. The furniture was the same, the pictures on the walls hadn't moved, but the atmosphere had shifted. Where there had once been only heavy, lonely silence, there was now a new rhythm, a flow of words, quiet smiles, and even the occasional burst of laughter. And Caleb noticed it every time he crossed the street with a warm plate in his hands. That night, he decided to make roasted chicken with mashed potatoes and grilled vegetables, a more elaborate dinner to mark the end of a week that, somehow, felt special. When he arrived, he found Ben waiting at the door. "I knew you'd come," the boy said, his eyes shining with excitement. Caleb chuckled. "Oh yeah? How'd you know?" "Because you never let us down." That simple sentence warmed Caleb's heart in a way he hadn't expected. He stepped inside and saw Lily helping her father set the table, something that just a week ago would have been unthinkable. Even Michael seemed more engaged, more present. There was still sadness in his eyes, of course, but it no longer consumed every part of him. As they served the plates, Lily looked at Caleb and asked, "Have you always cooked like this?" Caleb smiled. "Since I was a teenager. My mom taught me." Michael, curious, asked, "Did she cook a lot?" Caleb nodded. "All the time. It was her way of showing love. She always said food could warm not just the body, but the heart too." Lily smiled. "My mom used to say something like that. She said a good meal could turn a bad day around." There was a brief, respectful silence at the table. Then, as always, Ben broke the moment with his unfiltered honesty. "So, does that mean if we keep eating like this, our days will just keep getting better?" Everyone laughed, and Michael ruffled his son's hair. "I think so, buddy. I really think so." Dinner continued in a light-hearted, relaxed way. Caleb noticed that the family was talking more now. They chatted about small things, school, homework, a terrible joke Ben had heard at recess. Simple details, but they revealed something important. Life was returning to this home. When they finished eating, Lily stood up and started clearing the plates. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said. But she just smiled. "You cook for us. I think it's only fair we help with the dishes." Michael stood up too. "Yeah, I think we can handle this part." Caleb was surprised. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. Ben tugged at the hem of Caleb's shirt and whispered, "You're coming tomorrow too, right?" Caleb looked at Michael, who smiled and shrugged. "I think it's already part of our routine." Caleb grinned and ruffled the boy's hair. "Then I'll be here." That night, as he walked back home, Caleb felt something different inside him. It wasn't just satisfaction, it was belonging. And maybe without realizing it, he was being changed too. The next morning, Caleb woke up to an unexpected message. "Michael, good morning. Just wanted to say that if you ever need anything, know you can count on us." Caleb smiled as he read it. He had never expected anything in return for helping the Parkers, but it was nice to know that what they had was no longer one-sided. Something real was forming, a friendship, a genuine bond. Throughout the day, as he worked, Caleb found himself thinking about it. Just a few weeks ago, he had been nothing more than a distant neighbor. And now, he felt like he was part of something bigger. That night, Caleb decided to make homemade lasagna, a more elaborate dish, but one that had always brought him good memories. Before leaving his house, he grabbed a bottle of grape juice and headed to the Parker home. This time, when he knocked on the door, it was Lily who answered. "Hey, Caleb," she said excitedly. "Ben was already asking if you were really coming." "I said I'd be here, didn't I?" "Yeah, but he's impatient." She laughed and stepped aside to let him in. Michael was already setting the table and looked at Caleb with a lighter expression than before. "I hope you don't have anything important to do after dinner." "Why?" Michael smiled. "Because tonight, we took care of dessert." Caleb raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really?" Just then, Ben came running into the kitchen, holding a plate covered with a kitchen towel. "Apple pie," he announced proudly. "We tried to make it at least," Michael joked. "Lily helped with the dough, and I tried not to mess everything up." Caleb laughed. "That's amazing. I can't wait to try it." They had dinner together as usual, but something felt different that night. For the first time, Michael didn't seem like just someone receiving help. He was giving back, finding his own way to be part of this new routine. After dinner, when they finally moved on to dessert, Caleb took a bite of the pie. "Well?" Lily asked, eager for his verdict. Caleb put on a thoughtful expression, chewing slowly. I think you guys should open a bakery." Ben cheered, and Michael let out a light-hearted laugh. "I'd say it was more luck than skill." Caleb shook his head. "No, it was effort. And care. That makes all the difference." Michael looked at his kids, who were clearly happy, and let out a deep breath. "You know, I used to think everything depended on me. That I had to figure it all out on my own. That I couldn't show any weakness. But now, here we are. Sitting at the table, cooking together, laughing. And I realized that maybe this is what really matters." Caleb nodded. "The pain doesn't just disappear overnight, but we find ways to move forward." Michael smiled and lifted his glass of juice. "Then here's to that." Everyone raised their glasses and toasted. And in that moment, Caleb realized that simply helping without expecting anything in return had created something he never expected to find: a true connection. Caleb's routine with the Parkers remained strong in the weeks that followed. Their shared dinners had become a natural habit, something they all looked forward to at the end of the day. But without even realizing it, their little support system was beginning to grow. It all started when their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a gray-haired woman with a curious gaze, made a comment as she saw Caleb leaving his house with a steaming dish in his hands. "Your friends must really love you, huh? Always bringing them food every night." Caleb smiled, not thinking much of it. "Oh, I'm just helping out a little." But the old lady wasn't satisfied with that answer. "And is anyone helping you?" Caleb hesitated. He had never thought about that before. He was doing this because he wanted to, not because he expected anything in return. But Mrs. Henderson's question lingered in his mind. That night, when he arrived at the Parker house, he mentioned his conversation with the neighbor. Michael chuckled. "So, she figured it all out, huh?" "Seems like it." Lily looked at him, curious. "What did she mean by who's helping you?" Caleb shrugged. "I think she meant that I need support too." Michael grew thoughtful. "And, do you?" Caleb opened his mouth to say no, that he was fine, but the words didn't come out. The truth was, over these past weeks, something inside him had changed. Being here, helping the Parkers, feeling like he was part of something bigger, it had filled a space he hadn't even realized was empty. But had he really allowed people into his life the same way he had stepped into theirs? Ben, completely distracted, broke the silence. "Maybe we could help other people too." Everyone turned to him. "What do you mean, buddy?" Michael asked. "We could do what Caleb did for us. Maybe there are more people who need help." His words made them all pause and reflect. And just like that, without even realizing it, Caleb's small act of kindness was beginning to turn into something much bigger than he had imagined. The next morning, as Caleb sipped his coffee, he received another unexpected message from Michael. "Michael, what do you think about making dinner for Mrs. Henderson? She lives alone. Maybe she'd enjoy some company." Caleb smiled. That night, instead of just bringing food to the Parkers, they decided to cook together. For the first time, everyone was in the kitchen, sharing tasks. Lily chopped vegetables, Ben mixed the dough for the bread, Michael supervised everything, and Caleb just watched, feeling the warmth of the moment. Dinner was a success. When they knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door with a warm dish in hand and smiles on their faces, the surprise and emotion in her eyes were indescribable. "Oh my goodness, is this for me?" "For all of us," Michael replied. She hesitated, visibly moved. I can't remember the last time I had dinner with someone." At that moment, Caleb realized that this simple act of cooking a meal had gone far beyond anything he had expected. It wasn't just about the Parkers anymore. It was about something bigger. Dinner with Mr. Henderson was a turning point. What started as a simple act of kindness from Caleb to the Parkers was now becoming something more, something that included even more people. That night, after dinner, as they helped clean up Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, Michael looked at Caleb with a different light in his eyes. "This reminds me of something Sarah always used to say." Caleb raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What was that?" "She always believed that small acts of love had a ripple effect, that when someone was touched by a genuine gesture, they'd feel the need to pay it forward." Caleb smiled. She was right. Michael looked around, watching as Ben played with Mrs. Henderson's little dog, and Lily chatted animatedly with the elderly woman about old family recipes. "I never imagined we'd be here, but now, I feel like we have to keep going." Caleb nodded. "So, how do we do that?" Michael thought for a moment. Mrs. Henderson mentioned her neighbor across the street, Mr. Thomas. "He lost his wife last year and has been living alone ever since. I think we could invite him over for dinner, too." Caleb crossed his arms and smiled. "Sounds like we already have our next step." The following night, the Parker house was bustling with activity. For the first time, cooking for someone else wasn't just Caleb's task. Everyone was involved. Lily helped prepare a hearty beef and potato stew, Ben insisted on being in charge of the rice, and Michael proudly took it upon himself to make dessert. "I've made apple pie once before. I think I can pull it off again," Michael said confidently. Caleb laughed. "With any luck, we won't have to pretend it's good." Michael put on a mock-offended expression, and everyone burst into laughter. Dinner was a success. Mr. Thomas, a white-haired man with tired eyes, was visibly moved when their little dinner crew showed up at his door with food and smiles. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Just have dinner with us," Lily said softly, taking his hand. That night, as they all sat around the table, talking and sharing stories, Caleb realized that this simple initiative had turned into something truly special. Grief still existed. The pain didn't just vanish overnight, but loneliness, that was breaking. And it had all started with a single meal. Dinner with Mr. Thomas was yet another step in a growing chain of kindness, one that none of them had even planned. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. What had once seemed like an isolated act of Caleb helping the Parkers was now evolving into a quiet movement of empathy and connection. The next morning, Caleb received an unexpected message. "Mrs. Henderson, I heard you're hosting community dinners. If you ever need help, I still make a mean homemade bread." He smiled at the text. Moments later, another message arrived. "Neighbors from the street, if you need ingredients or anything else, we'd love to pitch in. This neighborhood used to be much closer, and maybe it's time to bring that back." It was official. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was now taking on a life of its own. That night when Caleb arrived at the Parker house, he immediately noticed something was different. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing the table set for far more people than usual. Michael chuckled. "Well, looks like we're not the only ones in this anymore." Slowly, neighbors started to arrive. Mrs. Henderson showed up with her famous homemade bread. Mr. Thomas brought a bottle of wine, one he claimed had been saved for years for a special occasion. A young mother named Claire arrived with a dish of mashed potatoes. The elderly couple from next door walked in carrying a chocolate cake, and for the first time in a long time, the street felt alive. People talked, laughed, and shared stories. Michael looked around, eyes shimmering with emotion. "Sarah would have loved this," he said quietly to Caleb. "This is only happening because you all chose to keep going." Michael turned to him, smiling. "This only happened because you started it." Caleb felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined that cooking for a grieving family would turn into something so much bigger. Never had he thought that a simple gesture would transform into such a strong bond between people who had once been little more than strangers. But there they were, together, sitting at the same table, proving that the true meaning of community was found in the simplicity of a shared meal. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning of something even greater. That night, as Caleb watched everyone laughing and chatting around the table, he realized just how much had changed since that first stew he had made for the Parkers. Grief still existed, and the pain of loss didn't just vanish because of a single dinner. But something much deeper had been restored, a sense of belonging. As the night came to an end, people started saying their goodbyes. Mrs. Henderson promised to teach Lily and Ben how to bake homemade bread. Mr. Thomas said he wanted to share some of his old recipes. Claire, the young mother, suggested that everyone take turns making meals so that no one had to carry the weight alone. Michael looked at everything happening around him, then turned to Caleb. If someone had told me all of this started because a neighbor decided to bring over a bowl of stew, I never would have believed it. Caleb laughed, shaking his head. Neither would I. Michael fell silent for a moment before speaking again, his tone more serious. You do realize you changed our lives, don't you? Caleb looked away, uncomfortable with the recognition. I just did what anyone would have done. Michael smiled. No, Caleb. Most people feel something when they see someone suffering, but very few actually do something about it. You did. And I think it's time for something good to happen to you too. Caleb frowned slightly, confused. What do you mean? Michael took a deep breath, glancing around the room. I heard that you work in event planning, right? Yeah, I'm an event coordinator, but I've been feeling a little lost lately. Michael's smile grew. Well, I'm the manager of a big restaurant downtown, and we need someone to coordinate our events and community initiatives. After everything I've seen you do, I can't think of anyone better for the job. Caleb's eyes widened. You're kidding. Not at all. You have a natural gift for bringing people together and making a difference. I think you just hadn't realized it yet. For a moment, Caleb didn't know what to say. All he had done was follow his instincts and help someone in a difficult time. He had never expected anything in return. But now, here it was. A real opportunity. Something that could change his own life, too. So, do you accept? Caleb looked around. He saw Ben dozing off on the couch, Lily helping Mrs. Henderson stack the dishes, and Mr. Thomas smiling at him as if he already knew the answer. Caleb took a deep breath, then grinned. I accept. That night, as he walked back home, he realized something he had never really thought about before. Kindness always finds its way back. And this time, it was leading him straight to a brand new beginning.